The first thing you noticed about Elias Mercer was that he never looked at you straight. Not out of dishonesty, at least not the kind most people meant by that word. It was more like he had trained himself, over a long and painful stretch of years, to look just past everything, just past faces, just past movement, just past whatever small and fragile thing might, if he let it, force him to care again. He was 41 years old that summer, lean in the way men get lean when they forget to eat rather than when they're watching themselves. His hands were cracked at the knuckles from years of fence work and cold weather. His beard had gone past the point of intention. It was simply there now, like the scar above his left eyebrow and the slight drag in his right boot when he walked, things that had accumulated without permission. He lived 3 miles outside of Redstone Valley in a house that had once been a homestead and was now just 4 walls keeping the Wyoming wind from killing him in his sleep. He kept a small garden he rarely harvested. He owned 2 horses, one for riding, one because he hadn't gotten around to selling her. He had a neighbor named Cutter Hobbs who came by every few weeks to check that he was still breathing, which Elias tolerated with the grim patience of a man who has accepted that some people simply refuse to leave him alone. Elias Mercer had not been happy in 5 years. He had also, more deliberately, not been unhappy. He had worked very hard to stay in the middle, that flat, gray country between grief and living, where nothing could touch him and nothing needed to. It had been working fine until the morning he rode into town for flour and salt and happened to cut behind the Silver Rail Saloon because the main road was blocked with a busted freight wagon. But he almost didn't see them. The alley behind the Silver Rail was narrow and smelled like rotted wood, and worse. A pair of stray dogs had upended a barrel near the back kitchen door, and Elias was steering his horse wide of the mess when he noticed the shape crouched beside the overturned barrel wasn't a dog at all. It was a child. Then he looked harder and saw there were 2. Girls, both of them. Young. Maybe 9, maybe 10. Hard to tell with the dirt on them. They were twins, or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. Identical dark hair gone wild from weeks without a comb. Dresses that might have once been blue and were now the color of everything that had been worn too long and washed in creek water too cold to do much good. Bare feet. Both of them, in July heat that had been punishing the territory since May. One of the girls had found something in the mess the dogs had made, a half-eaten corn cake, or the remains of one. She held it in both hands and looked at it with the focused, measuring expression of someone conducting a very serious calculation. Then she tore it in 2 pieces, eyeballed them both, and passed the slightly larger half to her sister without a word. The other girl took it without a word either. That was all. That was the whole thing. Elias sat on his horse in the alley behind the Silver Rail Saloon and watched 2 little girls divide a piece of garbage they'd found in a knocked-over barrel, and something inside him, something he had spent 5 years building very carefully, brick by brick, out of silence and distance and sheer determination, cracked straight down the middle. He didn't move for a long moment. The girls hadn't noticed him yet. They were eating quietly, backs half turned, the way animals eat when they've learned that the world is mostly something that takes things away from you. He looked at their feet, at the broken sole of one girl's shoe. No, not a shoe, just a strip of leather she'd tied around her foot with a piece of rope. He looked at the knobs of their wrists, at the way they leaned shoulder to shoulder, not for warmth in the July heat, but simply because that contact, that small pressure of one body against another, was maybe the only comfort they still had. "Move on," said the part of him that had kept him alive and numb for 5 years. "It's not your problem. There's nothing you can do." Move on. He sat on his horse. He did not move on. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, unused. He cleared his throat. Both girls spun around so fast they nearly knocked each other over. The one who'd done the dividing, he'd learned later her name was Raina, shoved the remains of the corn cake behind her back in a single instinctive motion, like she expected to be punished for it. The other one, Lily, stepped half in front of her sister with her chin up and her jaw set in a way that made Elias think, absurdly, of a much smaller, considerably dirtier soldier. "We weren't doing nothing," Raina said. She had a flat, deliberate voice, like someone who'd learned to keep every feeling out of it. "It was on the ground." "I know," Elias said. "We didn't steal nothing." "I know that too." A pause. Lily hadn't taken her eyes off him. She was the quieter one. He could already see that. But the way she watched him was unsettling. Not afraid, just assessing. Like she was adding up columns in her head and hadn't decided yet which way the numbers fell. "You from the saloon?" Raina asked. "No." "You a deputy?" "No." "Then what do you want?" Elias looked at the two of them for a moment. Then he climbed down off his horse, looped the reins around a post, and said, "I was going to get flour and salt, but I haven't eaten since yesterday morning, and I think there's a place on Front Street sells hot food. You want to come with me or not?" The girls exchanged a look. The kind of look that only happens between people who have lived through the same things and no longer need words to communicate most of what matters. Lily gave the smallest nod. Raina looked back at him, still suspicious, still measuring. Why? And Elias, who had not been honest with much of anyone in 5 years, including himself, found that he had no dishonest answer to give her. "Because you split that corn cake even," he said, "and I've eaten enough food alone." The place on Front Street was called Mabel's, and it wasn't much. 4 tables, a counter, a menu chalked on a board that hadn't been updated since winter. But the coffee was hot, and the biscuits came out of the oven 20 minutes after they sat down, and the woman behind the counter, Mabel herself, presumably, a broad woman with gray-streaked hair and the look of someone who'd seen everything and filed it away without comment, set down 3 plates without being asked for a third. The girls ate the way children eat when they're not sure they'll eat again. Not sloppy, not desperate in a way that anyone watching could easily see, but thorough, methodical. Every bite accounted for. Raina ate with her left arm curved slightly around her plate, not guarding it exactly, but ready to. Lily ate slowly and watched everything. The door, the windows, Elias's hands. Elias ate his biscuit and drank his coffee and let them be. After a while, when the immediate edge had come off, Raina looked up and said, "What's your name?" "Elias Mercer." "We're Raina and Lily Cade." She said it like she was accustomed to introducing them both, like it was a practiced thing. Lily doesn't talk much to people she doesn't know. Lily, without looking up from her plate, said, "I talk when it's worth it." Raina gave him a look that said, "See what I mean?" And Elias almost smiled. Almost. "You girls live in town?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Raina's eyes shifted sideways for just a second. Not guilt, exactly, but the practiced evasion of a child who has been asked too many questions by too many people with the wrong kind of interest in the answer. "We stay around," she said. "Around." "Yeah." He looked at them both, at the bare-wrapped foot, at the collar of Lily's dress, where the stitching had come undone and been re-knotted with a different color thread, twice, at the way Raina had folded her napkin carefully and set it beside her plate, as if being careful with small things was how you kept yourself from falling apart. "Where are your parents?" he asked. And the way the girls' faces went, not sad, not scared, but simply still. The way a face goes when it has already done all its grieving for something and reached the other side where there's nothing left but the fact of it, told him everything before Raina opened her mouth. "Pa died in March," she said. "Ma died in April." She said it clean, no decoration on it, just the fact, delivered the way you deliver facts when the feelings attached to them have been used up. Lily was looking at the table. "I'm sorry," Elias said. Raina shrugged with one shoulder, the kind of shrug that wasn't careless at all. "We're managing." Jack. He left them that afternoon. He told himself he'd done what he could. Fed them, which was more than most people had apparently bothered with. They were alive. They were, in their unnerving, competent, half-feral way, clearly capable of surviving. Children in the territory survived terrible things every day. It was the nature of the place. He rode back to his house with his flour and salt and told himself he had done enough. He made dinner, ate alone, as he always did. The kitchen was quiet, in the way his kitchen had been quiet for 5 years. Not peaceful quiet, but the specific quiet of a room where there used to be sound and now wasn't. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for 2 hours, thinking about the way Raina had divided that corn cake. The next morning he rode back to town. He didn't go directly to the alley behind the silver rail. That would have been something he couldn't explain to himself. He went to the general store, bought a few things he didn't particularly need, stood on the porch for a while looking at the street. Told himself he was just checking. Told himself it was nothing. He found them 20 minutes later sleeping behind the livery stable, tucked into the corner where the hay bales met the back wall and the overhang kept most of the sun off. Lily was asleep. Raina was not. She was sitting against the wall with her knees pulled up and her eyes open, watching the entrance, which was the kind of thing that a child shouldn't need to know how to do, and which she clearly had been doing long enough that it had become habit. She saw him coming and didn't flinch. "You again?" she said. "Me again." He crouched down a few feet away, at eye level. He had brought 2 paper-wrapped parcels from the general store, dried apples, hardtack, a wedge of yellow cheese. He set them on the ground between them and said nothing. Raina looked at the food, looked at him, looked at the food again. "We don't take charity," she said. "All right." "I mean it. I hear you." "Then why?" "I'm not doing it out of charity," he said. He hadn't planned this speech. He wasn't a man who planned speeches. "I'm doing it because I've been alone for a long time, and sometimes you do something just because it's the thing that's in front of you, and doing nothing feels worse. That's all." Raina considered this for an uncomfortably long time. Lily had opened her eyes and was watching from her spot in the hay, perfectly still, perfectly quiet. "You lost somebody," Raina said. It wasn't a question. Elias looked at the ground for a moment. "Yeah." "Your wife?" He picked up a piece of straw and turned it between his fingers. "Yeah." Raina nodded slowly, like this confirmed something. "Pa used to look like you look," she said. "After Mama got sick the first time and we thought she might die, before she got better. He went around like there was nobody home behind his eyes." She paused. "Ma got better that time, then she didn't, later. But that first time she did." Elias had nothing to say to that. "You going to keep coming around?" Raina asked. "Probably." "Why?" He looked at her. 9 years old, 10 maybe, with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw and 5 months of hard, impossible, unasked-for survival already worn into the lines of her face. "Because you split that corn cake even," he said. "I already told you that." "That's not a real reason." "Maybe not," he said, "but it's the one I've got." For the next 2 weeks, Elias fed them. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't bring them to town, didn't announce himself to the sheriff's office, or the church, or any of the other institutions that theoretically existed to do something about 2 orphaned girls sleeping behind livery stables. He had reasons for that, some of them clear to him, some of them not quite yet. Partly it was that he didn't trust institutions. He had lived in Redstone Valley long enough to understand that the machinery of official help often ground people up more thoroughly than neglect did. Partly it was that the girls didn't want it. They had made that clear on the 3rd day, when he'd mentioned offhandedly that maybe he should speak to someone about finding them a proper situation. And Raina had looked at him with an expression so cold and so complete that he had changed the subject immediately. But mostly, and this was the thing he hadn't admitted to himself yet, it was because he wasn't ready to hand them off to anyone. Because in 2 weeks of morning visits and shared meals eaten on hay bales or creek banks or the tailgate of his wagon, these 2 girls had done something to the flat gray territory inside him that nothing else had touched in 5 years. They had not tried to comfort him. They had not asked him questions designed to make him open up. Raina talked when she had something to say, which was often and usually worth listening to. Lily talked rarely, but when she did, the sentences were precise and unexpected, and occasionally so accurate they were uncomfortable. They were not easy children. They had edges. They had silence. They had the particular stubbornness of people who have learned that softness costs too much. But Elias Mercer, who had spent 5 years building walls against the world, recognized all of that. He recognized it because he had built the same things in himself. The morning everything changed was a Tuesday, 17 days after he'd first found them. He arrived at the livery stable at his usual time to find Raina sitting outside with a look on her face he hadn't seen before. Not her usual watchful distance, but something tight and frightened underneath the surface of her control, something she was working hard to keep from showing. "What happened?" he said immediately. "Nothing." Raina. She pressed her lips together, looked away, then looked back, and he could see the effort it cost her. "2 men were asking around yesterday," she said. "At the saloon, at the feed store, asking if anyone had seen us." She paused. "They work for Sheriff Vance." The name landed differently than names usually did in that valley. Elias had heard it before, the way you hear a sound in the walls of a house. Not dramatic, just present, just a thing that was always there if you knew to listen. Gideon Vance had been sheriff of Redstone Valley for 11 years. He was a tall, unhurried man who wore his authority the way some men wore a Sunday coat. Like he'd had it long enough, it had become his actual skin. He was not, as far as most people in the territory would say out loud, a bad man. He was an effective man. He was a powerful man. He was the kind of man who made problems go away so quietly that most people never had occasion to wonder how. "Why is Vance looking for you?" Elias asked. Raina was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We need to tell you something about how Pa died." Well, they told him in the back of an abandoned smokehouse half a mile from the livery, while Lily sat cross-legged on the floor and drew lines in the dirt with a stick, which was what she did when she was thinking hard about something. Thomas Cade, their father, had worked the Belmore copper mine for 3 years before his death in March. It had been recorded as a tunnel collapse. Accident. Common enough out here. A few words in the county ledger, a small marker in the Redstone Cemetery, and the world moved on. But in the weeks before the collapse, Thomas Cade had found something wrong in the mine's ownership records. Parcels of land, the kind that should have been federal claim territory, showing up in the private accounts of men whose names shouldn't have been on any title. Survey documents that had been altered, deaths in the mine over the past 4 years that, when you looked at them on a map alongside the contested land parcels, formed a pattern that wasn't accident. He had written it down, all of it. He had put it in a tin box, and the night before he died, he had buried that box under the floorboards of their house, the house that had been their home before their mother died, and everything after was just surviving, and told their mother where it was. Their mother had tried to tell someone, a man she thought was a federal contact passing through Redstone. She had been wrong about what he was. She was dead 6 weeks after Thomas. Raina delivered all of this in the same flat, controlled voice she used for everything, but her hands, resting on her knees, were gripping the fabric of her dress so hard the knuckles had gone white. Lily, without looking up from her dirt drawings, said quietly, "2 of Vance's men were at the house the night Mama died. We saw them from the creek." The smokehouse was very still. Elias looked at the 2 of them, this 9-year-old, 10-year-old wreckage of a family that had done nothing wrong except see something they weren't supposed to see and refused to pretend they hadn't, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Rage. Clean, cold, and very specific. "The box," he said. "It's still there? Under the house?" Raina looked at him with those measuring eyes. "We need to know if you're going to help us," she said, "or if you're going to do what everyone else has done." "What's everyone else done?" "Looked away," she said. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where's the house?" They went that night, after dark, when the road to the Cade property was empty, and the only light was a partial moon that gave just enough visibility to move by, and not quite enough to be seen. The house was a ruin, not from age, but from something more intentional. The windows were gone. The door had been removed from its hinges. Someone had gone through the place with the thoroughness of people looking for something specific, pulling up boards, cutting open mattresses, scattering whatever had been left behind. The family's life was spread across 2 rooms like it had been turned inside out by an indifferent hand. Raina walked through it without expression. Lily stopped just inside the door and stood there for a moment, very still. Then she moved to the window frame and looked out at the dark yard. And Elias understood, without her saying anything, that she was looking at the place where she had last seen her mother alive. He didn't say anything. He went to the back room, found the broken floorboard Raina directed him to, third from the window, offset from the wall, and dug with his knife blade between the boards until one came loose. The tin box was still there. It was a modest thing, no bigger than a cigar box, dented at one corner, with a rusted latch that still opened. Inside, 3 folded papers, close written in a miner's careful hand, a crude map, a list of names. He read it by candlelight, crouched on the floor of a house that had been torn apart by the people those names represented. By the time he was done reading, the rage had settled into something colder and more useful. He looked up at Raina and Lily, standing in the doorway watching him. Your father was thorough, he said. He was careful about things, Raina said. He said if you're going to say something is true, you have to be able to prove it's true. Otherwise, it's just words, and words are easy to ignore. Elias folded the papers and put them back in the tin. This needs to get to a federal marshal, he said. Not county, not territory, federal. Cheyenne, Raina said immediately, like she'd had this conversation with herself many times already. Cheyenne. He looked at them both. Vance has men all over this county. If he knows you're moving, if he knows you have this issue, the road won't be safe. We know, Lily said. It's going to be hard going. We know that too, Raina said, and there was nothing in her voice that sounded like a child. Elias looked at them for a long moment. Two dirty, barefoot, impossible children standing in the ruins of their home, asking him, with nothing but their patience and the specific steadiness of people who have already survived the worst thing and kept walking, to do the thing he'd spent 5 years convincing himself wasn't his problem. He put the tin box inside his coat. We leave before dawn, he said. He rode back to his property that night and stood in his kitchen for a long time. He thought about what he was doing. He thought about it honestly, the risks of it, the likelihood of it going wrong, the ways in which 2 children and a box of documents and one middle-aged man with no particular standing in the world were poorly equipped to bring down the most powerful man in Redstone Valley. He thought about the fact that he hadn't planned this, hadn't asked for it, had, if anything, spent years arranging his life specifically so that nothing like this could happen. He thought about the morning he had stood in this kitchen 5 years ago and understood, with the slow, terrible clarity of a man whose certainty has just been removed from the world, that his wife was not coming back. That the person who had made this house into a home and this life into something worth living had gone where he couldn't follow, and that all the wishing and all the silence and all the gray-flat numbness he could manufacture was not going to change that. He'd survived it by making himself into something that didn't need anything. He looked around the kitchen. The cold stove, the single cup on the shelf, the table with one chair pulled out and the others pushed in. He thought about Raina tearing that corn cake in half with the careful precision of someone who has learned that fairness is a thing you have to build yourself, because the world will not build it for you. He thought about Lily standing at that window frame, looking out into the dark. He turned off the lamp and went to pack his saddlebags. Some decisions aren't made, they accumulate. And then one morning you look up and realize that the person you've been building yourself into, careful, protected, finished with wanting, is someone you no longer recognize, and that the walls you built to keep the world out have been keeping you in. Elias Mercer rode out before the sun came up. He did not look back at the house. The girls were waiting where he'd told them to wait, at the split boulder 3 miles east of the Cade property, just off the creek trail where the cottonwoods grew thick enough to swallow a person from view. He'd half expected them not to be there, not because he thought they'd run, but because he'd given them an out the night before. In the way a man gives an out when he's not quite sure he deserves to be trusted. He'd said, "If you change your mind, I'll understand." Raina had looked at him with the specific patience of someone who is tired of being underestimated. "We won't change our minds." She'd been right. They were sitting together on the flat side of the boulder when he rode up, Lily asleep against her sister's shoulder and Raina awake, watching the road, the same way she'd been watching the entrance to the livery. She had a small bundle beside her, a piece of canvas rolled and tied with rope, containing what he assumed was everything they owned in the world. It wasn't large. He climbed down without a word and tied his horse to a branch. He had his riding horse and the bay mare he'd been meaning to sell for 2 years, loaded now with saddlebags and a bedroll and enough food for 5 days if they were careful and 3 if they weren't. "You bring everything?" he asked. "There wasn't much to bring," Raina said. He looked at the bundle. He looked at Lily, sleeping. One cheek pressed against her sister's arm, mouth slightly open, and something in the ordinary vulnerability of it, the way sleep stripped even the most guarded child down to just a child, hit him somewhere in the chest he wasn't ready for. He turned and checked the mare's girth strap instead. "Wake her up gentle," he said. "We need to move before the light comes full." Raina put a hand on Lily's shoulder and said her name once, quietly. Lily opened her eyes immediately. Not the slow surfacing of deep sleep, but the instant alertness of someone whose sleep had always been something to escape quickly. She sat up, looked at Elias, looked at the horses, and stood without a word. He helped them both onto the mare, Reyna in front, Lily behind her with her arms around her sister's waist, and they rode out before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. The road east was empty at that hour. The territory held its breath in those first gray minutes of morning, that particular stillness before the heat came down and the day declared itself. Elias kept them off the main road when he could, following the creek trail east, threading through the cottonwoods until the creek bent north and they had to make a choice. "How long to Cheyenne, Ribty?" Reyna asked. She'd moved up to ride beside him once the trail widened, leaving Lily sole command of the mare, which Lily appeared to prefer. 4 days hard ride, Elias said. 5 if we're cautious, maybe 6 if the weather turns. 6 days is too long. I know that. If Vance's men were already asking about us, I know, Reyna. She went quiet, but the quality of her quiet was the thinking kind, not the defeated kind. He was learning to read the difference. The problem was this. The direct route to Cheyenne took them through Decker's Pass, which was also the only reasonable road through the eastern range for a wagon or a horse carrying any real weight. It was the road everyone used. It was, therefore, the road that Vance's men would watch first if they understood what was moving. There was another way, an old surveyor's route that cut through the canyon system south of the pass, through country that was hard-going but largely unwatched because largely impassable to anyone who didn't know it. Elias had ridden part of it once, years ago, with a man named Darnell, who'd spent 20 years mapping the territory's forgotten corners before a rock slide took his left leg and persuaded him to become a saloon owner instead. He wasn't fully certain he remembered the route correctly. That was the problem he was sitting with. The other problem was more immediate. They had been riding for just under 2 hours when Lily said, without preamble, from behind Reyna's shoulder, "Someone's following us." Elias didn't look back directly. He looked at the angle of a hawk circling above the ridge to the southwest, using it as an excuse to turn his head a fraction. "How far?" "Half-mile, maybe. 2 riders. They've stayed the same distance since the creek bend." He'd said nothing about teaching her to watch for that. She'd either worked it out herself or been doing it so long it was simply reflex. "Could be anyone on the road," Reyna said, though her voice said she didn't believe it. "Could be," Lily said. "They stopped when we slowed to cross the stream, started again when we moved." Elias made a decision. He turned the horses off the trail into the scrub, cutting due south through brush that dragged at the horses' legs and forced them to slow, following a drainage line he could see from the slight depression in the vegetation. Behind them, nothing followed, or if it did, it couldn't move as quietly through the brush. He pushed them for 20 minutes until the drainage opened onto a dry wash broad enough to move through quickly, and then he let the horses pick up speed heading southeast, away from the Cheyenne Road entirely. "Where are we going?" Reyna asked. "Around," Elias said. "Around where?" "Around whoever that was." He glanced at her. Lily was right. That wasn't casual riding. Reyna accepted this without argument. Another thing he'd noticed about her. She didn't fight facts. She might argue about interpretations, about decisions, about whether Elias was being careful enough or not careful enough. But when the facts were plain, she adjusted to them without wasting time on denial. It was a quality most adults he knew lacked entirely. They made camp that first night in a rock shelter he found by following the dry wash until the canyon walls rose high enough on both sides to provide cover. It wasn't comfortable. The ground was hard and the rock held the day's heat in a way that made the air close and dry. But it was invisible from above and 3-sided, which was worth more than comfortable. He built no fire. The girls ate hardtack and dried apple and cheese, and Elias ate the same, and nobody complained about any of it. That was another thing. Lily was looking at the canyon wall above them, running her eyes along the rock with the focused expression she got when she was cataloging something. "These formations," she said, "the striping. Pa used to talk about reading rock like a map. He said the layers tell you what the water did, and the water tells you where it goes." "Your father teach you that?" Elias asked. "He taught us some. The rest I just watched." She traced a finger along a line in the air, following something in the stone above them. "There's a lot of water runoff through here. The canyon goes deeper southeast. The floor would be harder there. More solid rock, less loose stone." "Good for horses?" Probably. Better than the wash we came up. He looked at her for a moment. She was still studying the rock, calm and thorough as a surveyor. How old are you? He asked. 9, she said. Raina's 9.5. Half matters, Raina said, from where she'd already arranged her bedroll with the particular efficiency of someone who'd been making do with whatever ground was available for months. The half matters, Elias agreed. Raina made a sound that was almost a laugh. The first time he'd heard anything like it from her. It was brief, and she sealed it off quickly, but it had been there. He lay back on his bedroll and looked at the stars through the gap in the canyon walls and listened to the girls settle into sleep. Raina went first, despite herself. She'd been awake since before dawn, and the day had been hard. Lily stayed awake longer. He could tell by the quality of her stillness, the faint shift of her breathing. Not anxious, just watchful, the way she always was. After a while, she said very quietly, "Mr. Mercer." Elias. A pause. She was considering whether to use his name or not. She wasn't a child who moved into familiarity easily. "Elias, do you think they know we have the box?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I think they know you exist and that your parents didn't die by accident, and that's enough reason to find you. Even without the box. Even without it." Silence. "Pa said the names in those papers included people in Cheyenne," she said. "Not just Vance. People higher than Vance." He'd read those names. He knew what she meant, and the weight of it had been sitting in his chest since the night before. A cold, specific pressure he hadn't shared with them because there was no benefit in sharing it yet. "Yeah. So even if we get there, not everyone in Cheyenne is dirty," he said. "And a federal marshal who's not in Vance's pocket needs only one clean man above him to make this work. That's all it takes." "How do you know there is one?" He didn't answer right away. Because the honest answer was that he didn't know, not for certain, and she deserved better than false comfort wrapped up to look like confidence. "I don't," he said. "But if the evidence is as solid as your father made it, a corrupt man would have to be very stupid to ignore it, because the evidence will still exist whether he buries it or not, and eventually, it finds someone with the nerve to use it." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Pa believed that too," she said. "That truth was harder to kill than people." "Your pa was probably right." Another silence. Then, "He was wrong about the man he trusted in Redstone." "Yeah," Elias said, "he was. And your mother paid for that." It was a blunt thing to say. He half expected her to retreat from it. Instead, she said, "I know, I've thought about that a lot. I think good people are sometimes wrong about who deserves their trust, and that's not the same as being wrong about everything." 9 years old. He didn't say anything to that because there was nothing to add. She went to sleep a while after, and Elias lay in the dark thinking about a dead miner who had believed in documented truth, and a wife who had believed in one wrong man, and 2 daughters who had survived all of it, and were still, against all reasonable odds, oriented toward something he could only describe as hope, not the bright, easy kind, but the dug-in, kept alive by stubbornness kind, which was the only kind that lasted. He thought about his own wife, Clara. He didn't let himself think about her often. It was a door he kept closed, not locked. He wasn't delusional about what grief required, but firmly shut, because opening it cost too much, and he hadn't been willing to pay the price. She had been a woman who fed every stray animal that came within a quarter mile of their property and argued with him about everything and laughed at things that weren't quite funny enough to justify laughter, which had always made them funnier. She had been specific and difficult and the most genuinely alive person he had ever known. She had been dead 5 years and 3 months. He thought about what Lily had said. Good people are sometimes wrong about who deserves their trust, and that's not the same as being wrong about everything. He thought about the 5 years he'd spent being wrong about whether anything deserved his trust again. He closed his eyes and worked at sleeping. The second day was harder. They broke camp before first light and followed Lily's read of the canyon deeper southeast, and she had been right about the rock floor. It was harder, more solid, easier on the horses, and quieter than the loose wash had been. But the canyon also narrowed as it went, and by mid-morning the walls were close enough on both sides that a man with a rifle on the rim could have done considerable damage without breaking a sweat. Elias didn't love it. "We need to get out of this canyon before we camp tonight," he said. "There's a break in the east wall about 2 miles ahead," Lily said. I saw it in the rock formation this morning. The stripping changes. Softer sediment means water carved through at an angle. There'll be a draw coming down. He looked at her. You saw all that while we were riding? Pa showed me how to look. Your father must have been something. Lily was quiet for a moment. He was ordinary, she said finally. He was just careful. He paid attention to things most people didn't bother with. A pause. I think that's what got him killed. There was nothing soft about the way she said it, just the fact of it, laid down like a stone. They found the draw where she said it would be, a diagonal cut through the east wall that opened onto a broad plateau with good sight lines in 3 directions and a thin stand of juniper that would break their silhouette from a distance. Elias felt his shoulders drop slightly. Tension he hadn't been aware he was carrying. They stopped to water the horses at a seep near the base of the draw, and it was there that Raina pulled him aside while Lily walked the horses in slow circles to cool them down. I need to tell you something I didn't tell you before, she said. He waited. She picked at the edge of her sleeve. It was the first genuinely nervous gesture he'd seen from her, and it made her look her age in a way that was briefly painful. The man Mama trusted, the one she showed the papers to. She told us his name. She said if anything happened to her, we should not trust that name. She looked at him steadily. His name is Aldous Grant. He's a territorial surveyor. He passes himself off as a federal land contact. But he works for Vance. We think so. We never had proof. But Mama trusted him, and Mama died. And the 2 men we saw outside our house that night, one of them was him. Elias absorbed this. You're telling me now because I didn't know you before. I didn't know if you were someone I could tell that to. She met his eyes squarely. Grant moves between Redstone and Cheyenne. If he knows we're heading there, if he gets there before us, he could warn whoever he has to warn. He'd have to know where we're going. He'd have to guess, Raina said, and Cheyenne is the only logical place to go. He'll know that. She paused. He's not a stupid man. Elias thought about the 2 riders who'd paced them on the creek trail that morning. No, he said quietly. He probably isn't. Raina was watching him with that measuring expression. Are you sorry you got involved in this? He considered lying, then considered the girl asking. Ask me again when we're done, he said. Something shifted in her face. Not quite trust. She wasn't at trust yet, and he didn't expect her to be. Not with the education she'd had in what trust cost, but something adjacent to it. Something that was, maybe, the first threat of it being laid down. Okay, she said, and went back to help Lily with the horses. Samkam. By the afternoon of the second day, the plateau had given way to open country, rolling scrubland with draws and arroyos cutting through it at random, the kind of terrain that was beautiful in a stripped, indifferent way, and that offered both good cover and the constant possibility of a broken horse leg. The sun was a physical weight by mid-afternoon, the kind of July heat that turned the air above the ground into something you could nearly see. The girls didn't complain about it. They rode in the same focused, conserving silence they seemed to apply to most discomfort, managing it, not pretending it wasn't there. Around mid-afternoon, they crossed a ranch road and Elias pulled up short. There were tracks in the road. Fresh ones, cut deep by shod horses moving fast. 3 or 4 animals, by the depth and spacing, moving east. That's today, Lily said, reading the tracks from the saddle. Yeah. They're ahead of us, or circling around. He studied the road in both directions, then the low ridge to the north. If someone put riders out last night, they could have gotten ahead of us by cutting cross-country while we were in the canyon. Raina straightened in the saddle. They're trying to get between us and Cheyenne. Maybe. He pulled his horse back off the road. Which means moving faster is the wrong answer. Moving faster on the road is exactly where they want us. Then what? He looked south, toward where the scrubland rolled down into a rough tangle of dry creek beds and cedar breaks that looked, from here, like thoroughly miserable country. We go the ugly way, he said. Raina stared at the cedar breaks. Through that? Through that. She was quiet for a moment, then, okay. It won't be comfortable. It's not comfortable now. He almost smiled. Almost. They turned south. Oh, the cedar breaks were as bad as they looked. The horses picked their way through low, tangled growth that snatched at their legs and forced constant direction changes, the ground underneath uneven and sometimes treacherous where the creek beds had cut deep channels hidden under brush. Elias went first, picking the path. Lily, behind him, called out corrections twice. Once when he was heading for a channel hidden under dead growth. Once when she spotted a more open line through the cedars 30 yards east that cut 20 minutes off a miserable section. He took both corrections without comment. The second time, Raina said from behind them, "She always does that. Sees the way through things." "She's good at it," Elias said. "She's been doing it since before Pa died. She used to drive him crazy, pointing out faster routes." Raina's voice held something then, not quite warmth, not quite sorrow, but the specific texture of a memory that is both good and painful at the same time. He'd say, "Lily, I've been walking this valley for 12 years. And she'd say, "And you're still going the long way." Lily, from ahead, he laughed every time. "He did," Raina said. The cedar breaks opened eventually onto a long, dry flat, and they pushed the horses to a canter for the first time that day, eating up ground in the early evening light while the sky turned colors above the ridge. It was almost beautiful, if you could forget why you were moving. That night they camped without shelter in the open flat, under a sky so full of stars it looked like the dark had been worn thin. Too exposed for comfort, but they'd seen nothing behind them for hours, and Elias made a judgment call between the risk of visibility and the risk of another enclosed canyon, and chose the open. He took the first watch, sat with his rifle across his knees and watched the horizon in 4 directions, and thought about the names on the papers in his coat pocket. Thought about Thomas Cade bending over a surveyor's record by lamplight in a mine office, adding things up that nobody wanted added. Thought about a man careful enough to document everything and trusting enough to die for it. He thought about what Raina had said. "Are you sorry you got involved in this?" The honest answer was that he wasn't, and the fact that he wasn't told him something he'd been trying not to look at directly. That the man he'd been for 5 years, careful, sealed off, finished, wasn't actually who he was just who he'd become by default, by grief, by the slow accumulation of choosing nothing over choosing wrong. These girls had not fixed anything. His wife was still dead. The gray country was still there. He hadn't suddenly become the man he used to be. But somewhere between a split corn cake in a dirty alley and a 9-year-old reading canyon walls in the dark, something had come back online that he thought he'd switched off for good. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that. He watched the horizon and let Raina sleep and kept the watch. And when Lily tapped his shoulder at midnight to take her turn, which he'd told her he didn't need and she'd ignored, he handed it over and lay down, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, slept without trying. The third morning brought a problem he hadn't planned for. His riding horse came up lame. Not dramatically, not a break, not a serious injury, but a stone bruise picked up somewhere in the cedar breaks that left the animal unwilling to take full weight on the right foreleg. He checked it thoroughly, cleaned the sole, pressed the area with his thumb, while the horse flinched and stamped. Treatable. With time. Time was what they didn't have. He stood up and did the math. The mare could carry both girls. She was a good-sized animal, well-rested, and they didn't weigh much between them, but she couldn't carry all 3. Not over hard country, not for 2 more days. And leading a lame horse at walking pace while the other horse carried double was slow, too slow. "You ride the mare," he told the girls. "Both of you, like yesterday. I'll lead Cutter and walk when the ground is rough." Raina looked at him like he'd suggested something offensive. "You can't walk to Cheyenne." "I don't need to walk all the way. Just enough today to spare his foot. If he's better tomorrow." "How far are we?" 2 days. Less if we push the pace today on the flat ground. The canyon route gets us into the approach road by tomorrow evening." Raina looked at Lily. Lily looked at the lame horse, then at the terrain ahead, then said, "There's a ranch marked on the map Pa made, north of the canyon approach, maybe 4 miles off our line. Henderson's Station, I think." "I don't know it," Elias said. "Pa did. He traded supplies there twice. It's a working ranch. They'd have horses." "Trading takes money or goods." "We have the mare," Raina said immediately. He looked at her. "She's not your horse to trade." "She's not yours either." Raina said, not unkindly, just factually. You said you'd been meaning to sell her anyway. If someone at Henderson's will do a straight trade, we get a sound horse and don't lose time. It was entirely correct reasoning delivered with the confidence of someone who has learned to make decisions from facts rather than feelings. He recognized the logic because he'd been turning it over himself. All right, he said. Henderson's station, if we can find it. He clicked his tongue to the lame horse and started walking. Raina, from the saddle above him, said nothing, but he heard her shift her weight and settle in. Beside her, Lily had already pulled out the crude map her father had made and was studying it with the focused expression of someone who has work to do. The morning stretched out ahead of them, hard ground and open sky, and the constant awareness of everything behind them that was moving faster than they were. He kept walking. Henderson's station turned out to be harder to find than the map suggested, which wasn't the map's fault so much as the fault of 3 years of flash flooding that had rerouted the creek the station used as its landmark. They spent the better part of the morning following a dry bed that kept dead-ending in rockfall, before Lily looked at the sun angle and the distant tree line and said flatly, "We've been paralleling it. The station is north. We've been going northeast." Elias looked at the terrain, looked at the sun. She was right. "How long have we been going northeast?" Raina asked. "Since the second Arroyo crossing," Lily said. "That was 2 hours ago." Nobody said anything about it. There was nothing useful to say. He adjusted their heading, and they moved north. And the lame horse, Cutter, named after his neighbor who had always struck Elias as similarly stubborn and prone to going sideways, plodded along behind him with the patient resignation of an animal that had accepted its situation. His boots were not made for walking long distances over broken ground. He'd known that by the first hour and stopped thinking about it by the second. There was a blister forming on his left heel that was going to be its own problem eventually, but eventually was later, and later was where he kept everything that couldn't be solved right now. They found Henderson's station just past 11 in the morning. A working ranch built low and practical against a rocky hillside, the kind of structure that looked like it had grown out of the ground rather than been constructed on it. A main house, a solid barn, 2 outbuildings, a corral with 6 horses and a mule. A dog announced them from 50 yards out. A man came to the barn door with a rifle that he didn't raise but didn't put down either. He was 60 or so, burnt dark by decades of Wyoming sun, with a gray beard trimmed close and the settled, measuring look of a man who'd lived alone long enough to have no patience for anything he hadn't decided to let in. "Help you?" he said. "Looking to trade," Elias said. He stopped the horses a respectful distance out, in the open, so the man could see everything clearly. "I've got a good mare. Sound, strong, 5 years old. Picked up a stone bruise on my riding horse, and I need something I can put miles on today." The man looked at the mare, then at the girls, then at Elias's boots, which were dusty and worn at the heel in a way that clearly indicated recent walking. His eyes went back to the girls again. "That your children?" he said. "Yes," Elias said before he'd consciously decided to. A pause. He felt Raina look at him from the saddle, but she said nothing. The man studied the situation for a moment longer with the particular skepticism of someone who had been lied to enough times to build a strong tolerance for it. And then he lowered the rifle to his side and said, "Bring the mare in and let me look at her." His name was Walt Henderson. He'd built the station 30 years ago with his wife, who had died 12 years back, and he ran it now with 2 hands who were currently out on the south pasture and wouldn't be back until evening. He was not an unfriendly man, but he was a careful one. Every question he asked was quiet and specific, the kind that was looking for consistency rather than comfort. He walked around the mare twice, checked her teeth, her hooves, ran his hands down her legs, looked at the stone bruise on Cutter, nodded once. "I've got a roan gelding, 4 years, bit headstrong, but sound as rock. I'll trade straight." "Done," Elias said. Henderson looked at him. "You're not going to bargain?" "No." "A man who doesn't bargain on a horse trade is either a fool or in a hurry," Henderson said. "You don't look like a fool." "We need to move today." Henderson nodded slowly. He glanced again at the girls who had climbed down and were standing together near the corral fence, Lily watching the horses with her standard calm attention, and Raina watching Henderson with her standard watchful wariness. "You in trouble?" he said, low, Not unkind? Elias looked at him straight. Yes. Law trouble? The wrong kind of law trouble. The kind where the law is the problem. Henderson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside. I'll feed the children while you see to the horses." Walt Henderson's kitchen was the kitchen of a man who had learned to cook out of necessity and made peace with it over the years without ever making it a source of pride. There was bread and cold venison and a pot of beans on the back of the stove that had been there long enough to be either very good or questionable, and he put it all on the table without ceremony and told the girls to eat. Raina ate with her usual thoroughness. Lily ate slowly and looked around the kitchen with that cataloging attention she gave everything. The tools on the wall, the two chairs that were positioned to see both the window and the door, the worn Bible on the shelf with a woman's name written in the cover in careful script. "Your wife?" Lily asked, nodding at the book. "Margaret," Henderson said. "She picked good names," Lily said. Henderson looked at her for a moment with an expression that couldn't quite decide what it was. "She did," he said. Then he went back to the stove. Outside, Elias watered the horses and transferred the saddlebags to the roan, who was, as advertised, headstrong, sidling and tossing his head and requiring a firm hand to settle, and checked the girls' supplies one more time. The tin box was wrapped in cloth at the bottom of his coat saddlebag. He pressed it through the fabric once, just to confirm it, a habit he'd developed without intending to. When he came in, Henderson was at the table with a cup of coffee, and the girls were nearly done eating, and something had shifted in the room in the way rooms shift when people have been talking about things that matter. "I told him a little," Raina said to Elias. "Not apologetic, just informational." Henderson looked at Elias. "She told me about her father, about the mine." "How much?" Elias said. "Enough." Henderson set down his cup. "Tom Belmore's mine. I knew men who worked it, knew 2 men who died in that tunnel." He looked at the table for a moment. "The second death bothered me at the time. Man named Crocker. Good miner. Careful. Not the type to get caught in a collapse." He looked up. "I let it go because letting it go was easier. I'm not proud of that. Nobody offered him absolution for it, which seemed to be the right call because he didn't look like he was asking for it anyway." "Vance has riders out," Elias said. "We picked up a tail on the first day. I think they're trying to cut ahead of us on the Cheyenne Road." Henderson nodded. "There's a man comes through here sometimes, surveyor named Grant, Aldous Grant. Been through twice in the last month, which is more than the work requires." He looked at Raina. "That the name?" she said. "Yes," Raina said. "He was through 3 days ago, heading east." Henderson's voice held the specific flatness of a man saying something that has a clear implication he isn't going to state out loud because the person he's talking to is clearly capable of stating it themselves. 3 days ago, moving east, toward Cheyenne, ahead of them. Elias felt the cold pressure in his chest tighten another degree. He'd know we were coming. If he's watching the valley, he'd know you left. He wouldn't know the route. Henderson stood and went to a shelf near the door, pulled down a folded piece of paper. "But there are only so many ways through the Eastern Range. A man who knows this country could narrow it down." He unfolded the paper on the table. It was a hand-drawn map, older than Lily's father's but more detailed. A surveyor's copy, covered in notes in small, precise handwriting. "The canyon route south of Decker's Pass. You thinking that way?" "Yes." "Smart." He put a finger on the map. "But there's a section about here. Narrows, people call it. Maybe 3 miles in, where the canyon walls come within 20 feet of each other and the floor is loose shale. Single file only. If someone wanted to set up ahead of you, that's where they'd do it." Elias looked at the map, looked at the narrows. Thought about what a man with a rifle on those walls could do to 3 people in single file on loose shale with no cover. "Is there a way around it?" he asked. Henderson traced a line with his finger. "East wall has a fault line about a 1/4 mile before the narrows. Hard to see until you're close. It opens into a side canyon. Rough going, steep climb, but it comes out above the main canyon floor on the east rim. You'd bypass the narrows entirely." He paused. "I haven't been through there in years. It might be closed up since then." "But it might not be," Lily said. Henderson looked at her. "That's right, it might not be." How would we find the fault line? Elias asked. The rock on the east wall changes color about 50 yards before lighter gray, almost white, water staining. You'll see it if you're looking for it. He folded the map and held it out. Take it. Elias took it. I appreciate this. I'm not doing it for you, Henderson said. He looked at the girls. I'm doing it because I let something go 12 years ago that I shouldn't have, and I've spent a long time carrying that. He cleared his throat. Get those papers to someone who'll use them. Raina looked at him steadily. We will, she said. Not a reassurance, a statement of fact. They rode out of Henderson Station at noon with a sound horse under Elias, a clearer map in his coat, and a name, Aldous Grant, moving through his mind like a stone in a boot. The roan was headstrong, as promised. It spent the first 20 minutes trying to establish who was making decisions, and Elias spent the same 20 minutes making clear that it wasn't the horse, and after that they reached an understanding. He wasn't a gentle rider, never had been, but he was consistent, and horses, like most things, responded better to consistent than to kind. They made good time through the afternoon, moving southeast over the open plateau toward the canyon entrance. The country here was stark and wide. Vast sky, red rock, the occasional hawk riding thermals above the ridgeline. Beautiful in the way that doesn't care whether you're alive or dead to appreciate it, which is both the worst and most honest kind of beauty. Raina rode beside him for a stretch, quiet, which was unusual enough that he waited to see what it was. You said yes, she said eventually. He didn't follow for a moment. What? When Henderson asked if we were your children, you said yes. He kept his eyes on the terrain ahead. It was simpler. That's not why you did it. He didn't answer right away. The roan picked its way around a loose section of ground and he let it find its own footing. No, he said, it wasn't. Raina was quiet for a moment. We had an uncle, she said, Pa's brother. He came when Ma died, stayed for 2 days, told us there wasn't room for us at his place in Denver, and left. She said it without apparent bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness. He didn't say yes to anything. Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. I'm not saying that to make you feel bad, Raina said quickly. I'm saying it because most adults, when it gets hard, find a reason to leave, and you haven't. It's only been 3 days. I know how long it's been. He looked at her. She was watching the horizon with the same steady forward attention she brought to everything. Not performing equanimity, just possessing it, the real hard-won kind. Ask me again when we're in Cheyenne, he said. I already know what the answer will be, she said, matter-of-factly, and urged her horse forward to ride with Lily. He rode alone for a while after that, thinking about a man who had once had a wife and a house that meant something and a reason to come home in the evening, and how 5 years of choosing nothing had felt like survival, but had actually been something else, something closer to hiding from the fact that the capacity for all of it, for caring, for risk, for the terrifying vulnerability of giving a damn, was still there, intact, just waiting for something that made not caring impossible. 2 little girls eating garbage behind a saloon. The world had funny timing. Odd. They reached the canyon entrance at mid-afternoon, where the plateau broke apart and the red rock walls rose up on either side and the air changed. Cooler, closer, carrying the particular smell of stone that had held water once and was now dry but hadn't forgotten. The canyon mouth was broad, wide enough for 6 riders abreast, and the floor was solid sandstone with good footing, easy going to start. Lily, Elias said as they entered, you remember what Henderson said about the east wall? Lighter gray, almost white. Water staining, 50 yards before the Narrows. You're watching for it. I've been watching for it since we left, she said. Of course she had. The canyon narrowed gradually. In the first mile, the walls were still distant enough that the sky above was a broad blue strip. By the second mile, it had shrunk to a ribbon. The floor stayed solid, which was good, but the shale had started appearing in patches. Thin plates of gray-brown rock layered like old book pages, loose at the edges, the kind that cracked and shifted under a horse's weight and made noise while doing it. The noise was the problem. Sound moved differently in a canyon. It bounced off walls, multiplied, came back from directions that made no sense. The horse's hooves on shale were a steady, ricocheting percussion, that made Elias feel considerably more visible than he wanted to be. He slowed them to a walk, pointed to the softer shoulder of the canyon floor where sand had settled against the base of the wall and deadened sound. They moved single file along it, Elias in front, Raina behind him, Lily at the rear, which she'd taken without being asked because she wanted to watch behind them, and Elias hadn't argued. The canyon curved left, then right. The walls grew closer. He was watching the east wall with the focused attention of a man who is trying to notice something specific in rock that all looks the same, the endless red-brown-orange layering that he'd been staring at for an hour. When Lily said, very quietly, "Elias," he stopped. "Behind us," she said. "Not close, but there." He didn't turn. "How many?" "I couldn't tell." The sound bounced, at least 2 horses. He calculated the distances in his head. The Narrows were, by his estimate, less than a mile ahead. The east wall fault line was somewhere in the next half mile. Henderson had said 50 yards before the Narrows, which meant close, which meant if they missed it, they'd be in the choke point before they knew it. "We move," he said. "Steady, not fast. Fast makes noise." They moved. The canyon curved again and he stayed close to the east wall, watching it obsessively. Every color shift, every line in the rock, every shadow that could be a crack or a stain or nothing but his own wishful thinking. His right hand had moved to the rifle stock without his conscious decision. His heartbeat was measured and even, which surprised him slightly, because he'd expected fear and was getting instead something colder and more functional. The particular clarity that comes when the situation is simple enough that the only thing left is to do it right. Raina, directly behind him, was moving with her head up and her hands steady on the reins. She wasn't a trained rider. She'd been learning for 3 days, essentially, but she had the same quality her sister had, that core of calm at the center of difficulty. "I see it," Lily said. He stopped again. She was right. 50 feet ahead on the east wall, a section of lighter rock, almost gray-white against the surrounding red, streaked with old watermarks that ran vertically like long fingers. And there, where the fault had worked through the rock over the course of what must have been thousands of years, a crack in the wall wide enough for a horse, steep-sided, going up at an angle he estimated at 30 degrees. Rough going, steep climb. "That's it," he said. The sound behind them was clearer now. 2 horses, he agreed, maybe 3. Moving carefully, not fast. Someone who knew what they were doing, staying quiet, using the same soft shoulder they'd used. He didn't have time to think about it. He pointed to the fault line and sent Raina first, then turned to Lily. "You're next. Don't stop on the slope regardless of what you hear. You keep going up until you're on the rim." Lily looked at him steadily. "What about you?" "I'm right behind you." She held his gaze for 1 second, that measuring, column-counting look, and then turned the horse toward the fault line without another word. He waited until she was in the crack and moving upward before he followed, and as he turned his horse into the fault line, he caught, at the edge of his peripheral vision, movement around the canyon curve behind them, the shape of a rider, then another. He put his heels to the roan and started up. The climb was everything Henderson had suggested and worse. The fault was wide enough, but the footing was broken rock and loose material, and the roan, despite its stubbornness on flat ground, was actually well suited to this, digging in with something close to conviction, while Elias leaned forward over its neck and let it work. Above him, Lily's horse was struggling on a section where the slope steepened, and he heard her speaking to it in a low voice, not soothing, exactly, but instructional, telling it precisely where to put its feet the way her father must have once told her. And the horse found its feet and kept moving. Below, in the main canyon, the sound of horses had stopped. That was worse than if it had kept moving. He got to the section Lily's horse had struggled with and felt the roan's hindquarters bunch and drive, felt the loose rock sliding backward under the rear hooves, and for 1 long second it felt like they weren't going to make it. The physics of it going wrong, the angle too steep, the ground too loose. He shifted his weight hard forward, gave the horse its head completely, and the roan surged with the flat, determined effort of an animal that has decided to finish something. They came out on the east rim gasping. The canyon floor was 40 feet below. The Narrows were visible a 1/4 mile south, the walls closing to almost nothing, a dark slot of shadow that would have swallowed them completely and given anyone on the rim a clean, unhurried view of everything in it. Reyna was already there, white-faced but composed, holding her horse still and watching him come over the edge. Lily was beside her, one hand stroking her horse's neck in an automatic gesture, her eyes on the canyon below. Elias pulled the roan up and turned immediately to look. 2 riders in the canyon. They'd stopped at the base of the fault line, looking up. One of them, taller, in a dark coat, had his hand up shading his eyes, looking at the rim. Even at 40 feet, there was something recognizable about the deliberate, unhurried way the man moved. The particular posture of someone accustomed to never needing to rush because things generally arranged themselves to accommodate him. Elias didn't know Aldous Grant by sight, but Reyna, beside him, made a sound. Not a gasp, just a sharp intake of breath, controlled and quiet. "That's him," she said, "the one in the dark coat." Grant stood at the base of the fault line for a long moment, looking up at the rim where 3 people he had apparently expected to find in a canyon trap had just demonstrated they were not going to be easy to corner. Then he turned and said something to the other rider. The other rider nodded and wheeled his horse back the way they'd come. Grant looked up one more time. Then he turned his horse east and rode toward the Narrows entrance, not retreating, just recalculating. Moving to the East Canyon exit, the way out that would put him on the Cheyenne Road ahead of them. Elias watched him go. "He's not following us," Lily said. "No," Elias said. "He's going to Cheyenne." "To warn them," Reyna said. "To warn them." He looked at the route ahead. The rim ran east, rough but passable, toward where the canyon system opened back onto the high plateau. 2 days to Cheyenne. Maybe less now, if they pushed hard. But Grant on the main road with fresh horses and no need to stay hidden would be faster. Reyna was looking at him with the expression she got when she was doing math she didn't like the result of. "He'll get there first," she said. "Probably." "Then what we have in that box is still evidence," Elias said. "And evidence is harder to make disappear than people." He heard his own voice and recognized that he was repeating, almost word for word, what Lily had told him her father believed. The truth was harder to kill than people. Grant warning someone in Cheyenne means someone in Cheyenne knows we're coming. It doesn't mean all of them do, and it doesn't mean the documents stop being what they are. Reyna looked at him steadily. "You really believe that?" He thought about Thomas Cade, bending over ledger pages in a mine office, writing down every detail with the patience of a man who understood that documented truth was the only kind that outlasted the person carrying it. "Your father believed it," Elias said. "Enough to die for it." Reyna's jaw tightened. Then she straightened in the saddle and looked east toward Cheyenne. "Then we ride faster than Grant," she said. Elias pressed his heels to the roan, and they moved. They pushed hard through the rest of the afternoon, trading the safety of slow and hidden for the necessity of speed. The rim road was rough, but passable, and offered a view of the country for miles in every direction, which was its own kind of advantage. Nothing moved below them in the canyon. Nothing followed on the open plateau to their north. The sun was dropping fast when they finally came off the rim road and back onto the lower plateau, and Elias let the horses breathe for 10 minutes at a water seep before he pushed them on. Lily, drinking from her canteen, said, "He had 3 days head start before we left Redstone. Now he has a road lead, but he doesn't know exactly where we're going in Cheyenne." "He'll guess the marshal's office," Elias said. "There are 2 federal marshals in Cheyenne," Lily said. "We looked it up. Pa had their names." He looked at her. "You've been carrying that." "I carry what's useful," she said simply. "Marshal Garrett Pine and Marshal Cole Adkins. Pine has been there 12 years. Adkins came from Kansas Territory 14 months ago." "New man," Elias said. "New enough that he wouldn't have had time to build the same relationships," Lily said. "The same obligations." He sat with that for a moment. The logic was sound, and the source of it, a 9-year-old who had been preparing for this moment since before she fully understood what it meant, was something he couldn't quite find words for. "Adkins," he said. "That's what I thought," Lily said. They rode on into the darkening evening, 3 people and 2 horses on a hard plateau, with a day's hard riding still between them and the city, with a man who wanted them silent already moving ahead of them on a faster road. The stars came out, sharp and plentiful, the way they only are far from any town. Elias rode and said nothing, and thought about the names in the tin box, and thought about Marshall Cole Adkins, 14 months in from Kansas, new enough to be clean, and thought about how much was resting on that being true. He touched the tin box through his coat pocket. Still there. Still solid. Still somehow worth everything it had cost. He kept riding. They rode through the night. Not all of it. The horses couldn't sustain that, and exhausted riders made bad decisions. But most of it, stopping twice for an hour each time, letting the animals rest while Elias stayed awake and the girls slept in the way they'd learned to sleep on this trip, which was quickly and completely and without apparent concern for comfort. Raina curled on her side in the grass with her arm under her head. Lily lay on her back and looked at the sky for 10 minutes before her eyes closed, as if she needed to finish cataloging the stars before she could afford to stop watching them. Elias sat with his rifle and his thoughts, and the cold that came down off the Wyoming plateau after midnight, which was the serious, committed kind of cold that didn't care it was July. He thought about Grant on the Cheyenne Road, about the hours of lead the man had on them and what he would do with them. The most obvious move was to go directly to Garrett Pine, the senior marshal, 12 years established, long enough to have built the kind of relationships that made things manageable. Long enough to have been managed himself, maybe. But Grant couldn't be certain of Pine, not without a conversation that would take time. And every hour Grant spent talking to the wrong people or the right ones in the wrong order was an hour that kept the situation fluid. What Grant needed was for the tin box to never arrive, or to arrive and be buried, which was functionally the same thing. What Elias needed was for Cole Adkins to be the kind of man Thomas Cade had believed in, careful with facts, clear-eyed about what documented truth required, and for Adkins to be at his office and not already warned off or pressured sideways by whatever Grant was building in the hours ahead of them. A lot of need riding on a man Elias had never met. He watched the stars move and let Raina sleep and tried not to think too hard about the odds. They were moving again before the sky had fully lightened, and they came off the last stretch of Plateau Road onto the Cheyenne approach as the sun broke over the eastern ridge. The city announced itself gradually. First the smell of coal smoke and livestock, then the distant geometry of rooftops, then the full noise and density of a territorial capital that had been built fast and kept building and hadn't quite decided yet whether it was going to be permanent or just well-organized chaos pretending. Cheyenne in 1884 was neither the rough frontier camp it had been 15 years earlier, nor the settled city it was trying to become. It was the in-between thing, streets that mixed mud and planks and occasional cobblestone, buildings that ranged from canvas and timber to solid brick within a single block, a population that included cattle barons and railroad men and lawyers and gamblers, and a great number of people who were several of those things simultaneously. The federal marshal's office was on Warren Street, 2 blocks east of the rail depot. Elias knew this from a visit years ago, before Clara died, before everything. And the memory had the particular vividness of things recalled from a life that no longer exists. They came in from the west, moving carefully through the morning traffic of freight wagons and riders and pedestrians who paid them no particular attention. Elias kept his eyes on the street ahead and his hand near his coat, where the tin box sat in its saddlebag. The girls rode behind him close, Raina's horse nearly at the roan's flank, Lily watching the sidewalks with the systematic attention she brought to everything. It was Lily who said it first. "He's here." Elias didn't slow down. "Where?" "Left side, blue-painted storefront 40 yards back. He's talking to a man in a brown suit." He processed this without turning his head. Grant was already in the city, already in conversation. The man in the brown suit could be anything, a contact, a lawyer, a corrupt official preparing to do something about the evidence before it became evidence. Or nobody. A coincidental meeting on a street. He didn't believe in coincidences right now. "Did he see us?" Raina asked. Her voice was low and even. "I don't know," Lily said. "He was looking at the other man." "We don't stop," Elias said. "We go straight to Warren Street. If he follows, we deal with that when it happens." "And if he gets to Adkins before us?" Raina asked. "Then we knock louder," Elias said. He turned the roan east and they moved through the morning crowd. Oh, The federal marshal's office occupied the ground floor of a two-story brick building on Warren Street that had been built to suggest permanence and authority and mostly succeeded. A painted sign above the door read, United States Marshal, Wyoming Territory, in letters that had been touched up recently enough to still be legible, which Elias took as a mildly encouraging sign about the office's general state of organization. He tied the horses at the post out front and looked up and down the street. No sign of Grant. No sign of the man in the brown suit. The street was ordinary morning traffic and nothing else. Stay with the horses, he told the girls. If anything looks wrong, we're coming with you, Raina said. He looked at her. They need to see us, she said. We're the reason any of this matters. You're a stranger carrying documents. We're Thomas Cade's daughters. She held his gaze steadily. Let us do what we came to do. He looked at Lily, who had already climbed down and was standing at the hitching post with the specific stillness of someone whose decision has been made. Stay behind me until I know what we're walking into, he said. He pushed open the door. The interior of the marshal's office was divided by a wooden counter that ran most of the width of the room, separating the public space from the working area behind it. A deputy, young, freckled, the kind of young that made Elias feel his age, was sitting at a desk behind the counter looking at paperwork he didn't appear to be reading. Help you? The deputy said, in the automatic voice of someone saying a thing they say 50 times a day. I need to speak with Marshal Adkins, Elias said. It's federal business, urgency. The deputy looked at him, looked at the two dirty, trail-worn girls behind him, looked back at Elias. Marshal Adkins he's in a meeting right now. With who? A slight pause. I'm not at liberty. Is the meeting with a man named Aldous Grant, Elias said. The pause was longer this time, just long enough to be an answer. Elias put both hands flat on the counter. I need you to listen to me very carefully. My name is Elias Mercer. These girls are Raina and Lily Cade, daughters of Thomas Cade, who was murdered in the Belmore mine in March, along with their mother 6 weeks later. I am carrying documented evidence of multiple murders, land fraud, bribery, and corruption that runs from Redstone Valley through this territory's administration, and the man currently in a meeting with your marshal is one of the people named in those documents. I need to see Adkins right now. The deputy stared at him. Lily stepped up beside Elias. She was, at this moment, a small, dirty, bare-armed 9-year-old whose dress had a mismatched thread repair at the collar and who had been sleeping on open ground for 4 days. She looked directly at the deputy with her steady, particular eyes and said, Our father wrote everything down. He kept records. People died trying to make those records disappear. We didn't let them. She paused. Please. It was the first time Elias had heard her say, please to anyone. The deputy was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he stood up from his chair, moved to the door behind him, and knocked twice. Marshal, there are people out here that I think you need to hear this yourself. Cole Adkins was a lean, angular man in his late 30s who had the look of someone accustomed to sorting through other people's claims with the patient skepticism of a man who has been lied to creatively and often. He came through the door behind the counter with the measured quality of a man who does not move quickly for anyone, and he looked at the group in his waiting area, 1 weathered man, 2 small girls, with careful, non-committal attention. But he came through the door alone, which meant Grant, if he'd been there, had left by another way. Mr. Mercer, Adkins said. He had a Kansas flatness in his voice, unhurried. My deputy says you have federal evidence. I have documented evidence of federal crimes, Elias said. Multiple homicides recorded as accidents. Illegal land appropriation under falsified federal surveys. Bribery of territorial officials. And what amounts to the ongoing criminal operation of a county sheriff who has been using his authority to murder anyone who gets too close to the fraud. Adkins looked at the girls. These are the Cade children. It wasn't a question, which meant Grant had mentioned them, which meant Grant had been here. The confirmation settled in Elias's chest like a cold stone. They are, Elias said. And whatever that man just told you, he told me, Adkins said slowly, that 2 orphan children had been taken from Redstone Valley by an unstable man with a personal grudge against the sheriff, and that they were carrying forged documents intended to implicate Sheriff Vance in crimes he didn't commit. He paused. He was very calm about it, very organized. Another pause. That was 20 minutes ago. Elias held the man's gaze. And I've been in this territory for 14 months, Adkins said. In that time, I've had 3 cases involving the Belmore Mine District quietly redirected away from my office by people I haven't been able to identify. 2 witnesses I was developing disappeared without formal explanation. And a set of survey records I requested from the Territorial Land Office came back incomplete in ways that made no sense unless someone had removed material from them. He looked at Elias steadily. I'm not saying I believe everything you've brought me. I'm saying I have reasons to listen. The room was very quiet. Elias reached into his coat, unwrapped the tin box, and set it on the counter. Adkins looked at it. He didn't touch it immediately. He looked at it the way a careful man looks at something that might change the direction of his day significantly. Then he opened it. He read in silence. Elias watched his face and saw nothing dramatic. No jaw drop, no sudden pallor. Just a gradual tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw, the specific expression of a man whose suspicions are being confirmed in print one by one and finding the experience both satisfying and infuriating. Raina, beside Elias, was watching Adkins with her hands folded in front of her and her back straight in the particular posture she got when she was refusing to let anything show. Lily was watching his front window. Lily, Elias said quietly. Grant's outside, she said. Across the street. He has 2 men with him. Adkins looked up from the documents. How many? 3 total, Lily said. She wasn't looking at Adkins when she said it. She was still looking at the window, still counting. One of them has been on the street since we arrived. He was already there when we tied the horses. Adkins looked at his deputy. Something passed between them. A look that was both a question and an order. The deputy moved immediately to the back of the office. The survey maps, Adkins said, still looking at the documents. Your father, how did he get access to these? Raina answered. He worked the mine 3 years. He knew the land manager. The manager showed him the originals before he knew Pa had noticed the changes. After that, Pa worked from memory and what he could verify from public records. He cross-referenced the death dates with the land acquisition dates, Adkins said. It was half to himself. He turned a page. Every death that moved a parcel boundary. Every death that eliminated a claim dispute. He looked up. This is meticulous work. He was careful about things, Raina said. Her voice was exactly level. He said if you're going to say something is true, you have to prove it. Adkins studied her for a moment. Then he said, Your father was a brave man. He was ordinary, she said. He just paid attention. Something moved across Adkins' face. Not quite emotion, but the precursor to it, the place where the feeling was forming before he decided what to do with it. He closed it down and put it away, which Elias respected, because a man who gets emotional in the middle of a situation with 3 armed men outside is a man making a decision with half his brain. Grant wants those documents, Adkins said. He wants them gone, Elias said. And he wants the girls where they can't testify. He doesn't have legal authority to take anything from this office. He doesn't need legal authority if you're standing in his way and he decides to stop waiting, Elias said. He's been 3 steps ahead of us for 5 days. He's not a patient man playing a waiting game. He's a man who is running out of options. Adkins stood up straight. Deputy Marsh. His voice went to the back of the office without needing to be raised. Get Tanner and get him now. He looked at Elias. I have 2 more deputies in this building. I'm going to ask you to stay here with the girls while I go outside and address this situation. A pause. I'm also going to ask you to trust that I intend to do that. I don't know you, Elias said. No, Adkins said. But Thomas Cade didn't know the right man to trust, and it cost him everything. I'm asking you to make a different bet. Elias looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Raina. She gave him the smallest nod. Don't let those documents out of this building, Elias said. I have no intention of it, Adkins said, and walked out the front door. What happened on Warren Street in the next 4 minutes was not clean or organized or particularly dignified, which was perhaps appropriate for the ending of something that had been none of those things from the start. Elias watched it through the front window with the girls behind him, Lily standing on her toes to see over the sill. Adkins walked across the street with his badge visible and his hand resting on his holster with the easy authority of a man who has done this before and knows the value of body language in situations that could go several ways. He spoke to Grant in the flat, carrying voice of someone choosing to conduct a confrontation in public, on a public street, where witnesses are an unavoidable feature of the geography. Grant was not quite as calm as he had apparently been 20 minutes earlier. The man in the dark coat stood on the far sidewalk with his two hired men and said things that Elias couldn't hear through the glass, gesturing twice with the specific energy of a man who is making arguments he doesn't quite believe will work and is angry about it. His hands moved. His chin came up. He was, from a distance, still performing the authority he'd been trading on for years. The settled, unhurried certainty of a man for whom the machinery of power has always arranged itself. But the machinery had stopped arranging. When Deputies Tanner and Marsh came out the side door of the office and positioned themselves at the ends of the street, not running, not drawing, just present, just establishing geometry, Grant's two hired men looked at each other with the specific look of men calculating whether they are being paid enough for this particular moment. They were not. One of them turned his horse and walked it down the street without looking back. The other followed 30 seconds later, which was apparently how long it took him to do the same math. Grant stood on the sidewalk alone. Adkins said something to him, short and direct. Grant's jaw moved. He looked at the deputy at the end of the street. He looked at the marshal's office. He looked, Elias had the impression of it even through the glass, at some version of the future he'd been building for years, and understood that it had just changed shape in a way that was not going to change back. Adkins took the tin box from his own coat. He'd been carrying it when he walked out, Elias realized, and held it up briefly in Grant's line of sight. It was a small gesture. It was also a complete one. Grant was taken into custody without further incident, which was either a credit to Adkins' management of the situation or to Grant's intelligence in understanding that the arithmetic had changed irrevocably, and possibly both. The hours that followed were long, in the way that hours are long when the crisis has passed and the machinery of official response moves in to replace it. Adkins brought in 2 additional deputies from the territorial office. A federal judge was contacted. Telegrams went out, yet east, south, north, to contacts Adkins clearly had, and had been maintaining for exactly this kind of moment. The documents were formally logged, witnessed, signed. Adkins read everything twice and made notes in a leather-bound journal in the small, dense handwriting of a man who trusts his own records more than his memory. Elias sat in a chair against the office wall and watched all of it, and felt something leaving him. Not a bad thing, just a weight that had been there so long he'd forgotten it was weight and thought it was just himself. The tin box sat on Adkins' desk surrounded by papers and witness statements and the administrative apparatus of a federal case being constructed in real time. Thomas Cade's careful, dangerous truth was out of the ground and in the hands of someone with the authority to use it. Raina sat in the chair beside Elias. Lily had fallen asleep in the chair on his other side, her head tipped against the wall, her hands folded in her lap like she'd decided the moment her job was done, she could simply stop, which was, he supposed, accurate. After a while, Raina said, "He's going to go after Vance." "Today, maybe. Tomorrow at the latest," Elias said. "He'll need to move fast before Vance hears about Grant. Will it work?" He thought about the documents, about the survey maps and the death records and the names cross-referenced with dates, about the specificity of Thomas Cade's work, the way each piece connected to the next with the patient, unignorable logic of documented fact. "Yeah," he said. "It'll work." Raina was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the tin box on Adkins' desk, the dented, rusted latch ordinary tin box that had been buried under a ruined floor in a valley 4 days hard riding behind them. "Pa would have wanted to see it," she said. "I know. He worked so hard on it. He was just trying to do the right thing, and it got him—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way people look at ceilings when they are refusing to cry in public, which was a habit Elias recognized because it was his own. He didn't say anything. After a moment, she brought her eyes back down and breathed out slowly. He would have said it doesn't matter that he didn't get to see it, that the thing being true mattered more than him being there to watch. "He sounds like he was right about most things," Elias said. "He was wrong about people sometimes. So is everyone." She thought about that. He was right that the truth was harder to kill. She looked at the box again. We proved that. You proved that, Elias said. You and Lily. You carried it. Raina shook her head. You carried it. You found it. You kept it. You didn't let go of it when you had every reason to. She didn't have an answer for that. She sat with it instead, which was what she did with things that were too large or too true to answer immediately. Marshal Adkins sent deputies to Redstone Valley that same evening, riding hard with federal warrants and the kind of official weight that doesn't announce itself before it arrives. Elias heard this secondhand. He was at the hotel by then, having done the uncharacteristically extravagant thing of paying for 2 rooms, one for himself and one for the girls, who had been asleep in a real bed for approximately 90 seconds before the decision became irrevocable. He sat on the edge of his own bed and pulled off his boots and looked at the blister on his left heel, which was worse than he'd allowed himself to register while it was happening. He cleaned it and bandaged it with the methodical efficiency of a man attending to something that could have been attended to earlier and wasn't because earlier there hadn't been time. He sat for a while in the silence of the room. It was a different silence than the silence of his kitchen in Redstone. That silence was the absence of something. This was just a room being quiet, which was a different thing, smaller and more ordinary. He thought about what came next, the formal statements that Adkins had told him they'd need tomorrow, both his and the girls. The days or weeks of that, the machinery of it. And then after, the question he hadn't let himself think about clearly yet, because clear thinking about it required acknowledging that he'd been thinking about it obliquely for days. After. What happened to 2 girls with no family and no home, and a story that was going to be public knowledge in this territory within a month? He knew what he wanted the answer to be. Had known it, in some not quite admitted way, since the night he'd stood in that ruined house and put the tin box inside his coat and said we leave before dawn. Since the morning on the plateau when he'd said, without planning to, that they were his children. But wanting something and being the right person to have it were not always the same. He had a house, barely livable, 1 chair at the table, a garden he didn't harvest. He was 41 years old and his knees hurt in cold weather, and he had no practice at being responsible for anyone but himself. And at being responsible for himself he was, objectively, mediocre. He lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. From the room next door, through the wall, he could hear Raina's voice, low and murmuring, talking to Lily in the dark the way she probably talked to her every night, the steady thread of it, the presence that said, "You're not alone. I'm here." He couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. He thought about what Raina had said on the plateau. Most adults, when it gets hard, find a reason to leave. He thought about a man who had, for 5 years, been very good at finding reasons. He was still thinking about it when he fell asleep, which was the first time in longer than he could count that he fell asleep still in the middle of something rather than having closed everything down first. It was uncomfortable and also, somehow, better. In the morning, Adkins was at his desk by the time they arrived, and the expression on his face had the specific quality of a man who has had a productive night. "Grant talked," Adkins said without preamble. Elias stopped in the doorway. "When?" "About 2 in the morning. He was looking at a federal conspiracy charge that would put him in prison until he was an old man, and apparently that particular vision of the future loosened him up considerably." Adkins looked at the notes in front of him. He confirmed the land fraud operation, confirmed Vance's role, gave us names: 3 territorial officials, 2 mine supervisors, 1 man in the land office. We'd never have connected without him. A pause. He confirmed that Thomas Cade's death was ordered by Vance and Eliza Cade's. He looked up. "Your mother's name was Eliza?" he said to Raina. Raina was very still. "Yes." Adkins nodded. Grant was present for the conversation in which it was ordered. He paused, choosing the word carefully, participate in the act itself. But he was present for the order. He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know that we have it confirmed, and that it will be in the formal charges." The room was very quiet. Lily, standing beside her sister, reached out and took Raina's hand. Raina looked at their linked hands. Then she looked at Adkins. "It wasn't an accident," she said. "Not a question. She'd known it wasn't an accident for months, had been carrying the knowing of it without the official confirmation, which were two different things. No, Adkins said, it was not an accident. Something in Raina's face moved. Something she had been holding for a very long time. Holding because there had been no choice but to hold it. No safe place to put it down. She didn't cry. Or if she did, it was the kind that doesn't make noise, the kind that happens in the lines of a face and the set of a jaw, and the slow, deep exhale of someone releasing a weight they've been carrying so long they forgot it was separate from themselves. Lily's hand tightened around hers. Elias looked at the window. He was not a man who cried. Had not been since Clara. He stood at the window and looked at Warren Street going about its ordinary morning and let the girls have the moment and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he had learned over the last 5 days that this was sometimes exactly right. Gideon Vance was taken into custody 2 days later, at his own office in Redstone, by 4 federal deputies who arrived before he'd had any word of what was coming. Adkins had been careful about the timing. Grant's cooperation had made it possible to move fast enough that the network of people who might have warned Vance didn't have the chance. Elias heard about it from Adkins directly, in the office, while the girls were giving their formal statements to a federal recorder in the next room. A process that had been going on for 2 hours, and from which Raina, at least, had gone in with the focused calm of someone who has been preparing for this exact moment for months. "He came quietly?" Elias asked. "He came the way men like that come when the ground has fully gone out from under them," Adkins said. "Quiet enough." The words weren't quite there anymore. He paused. Deputies found 2 more sets of documents in his office safe that corroborate everything in Cade's box and add to it. The man kept records of his own crimes, which is not uncommon among that type. They believe the records make them powerful, proof of what they've done and gotten away with. "Until they're not getting away with it," Elias said. "Until then," Adkins agreed. He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at Elias with the direct, measured look he used for everything that actually mattered to him. "The girls are going to be required as witnesses when this goes to trial. It'll be months out, probably. They'll need to be reachable and stable." A pause. "I'm assuming you've thought about their situation." "I've thought about it," Elias said. "And?" He looked at the closed door of the room where Raina and Lily were giving the statements that their father had died trying to give himself, in the careful, documented, provable language he'd taught them to believe in. "I'm going to ask them," Elias said. "It's their decision." Adkins studied him for a moment. Then he nodded once, the short, final nod of a man who has assessed something and found it satisfactory. "There's a lawyer on Cary Avenue who handles guardian filings," Adkins said. "Tell him I sent you." Elias looked at him. "You said yes when Henderson asked if they were yours," Adkins said. "Lily told me that. In her statement, she said it unprompted." He looked at his desk. "Thought you'd want to know she noticed." Elias had nothing to say to that. He went and sat outside the door and waited for the girls to come out. He asked them that evening on the steps of the hotel, while the light went out of the sky over Cheyenne and the street in front of them filled with the ordinary noise of a city doing what cities do. He was not good at this. He had not prepared a speech. He said it plain, the way he said most things, that he had a house that wasn't much, and a garden he hadn't been attending to, and that he was 41 years old and had been alone for 5 years and was bad at most of the things that probably mattered and only moderately competent at the others. But that if they wanted to come back to Redstone with him and call it home, he would not leave. Not would try not to leave, not would do his best. He would not leave. Raina looked at him for a long time, long enough that he had time to regret every word and consider the possibility that he'd misjudged the whole thing from the beginning. Then she said, "The house. Is there room for a garden?" "More room than I've been using," he said. She thought about that. "Ma had roses," she said, "from her mother. She kept cuttings." "I know. You told me. We saved some," Lily said quietly from her spot on Raina's other side. "They're pressed in wax paper, in the bundle." He hadn't known that. He looked at her. "I took them the night you came to the house," Lily said. "The night you found the box. I didn't say anything because I didn't know then if you were someone I could tell things to." "And now?" he said. She looked at him with the steady counting eyes that had been adding him up since the first morning in the alley behind the silver rail. "Now I know," she said. Raina looked at her sister. Then she looked at Elias. "Okay," she said. "We'll come." He nodded. He didn't say anything else because there wasn't anything else to say right then, and also because his throat had done a thing he hadn't been expecting and he was waiting for it to stop. After a while, Lily leaned sideways and put her head against his arm, not quite resting it there, just letting it touch. A light tentative contact, the kind that asks without asking, that offers without demanding. He did not move. He looked at the street and let her stay there, and the evening settled around the three of them on the hotel steps, and the city went on being the city. And somewhere in Redstone Valley, a man who had believed he was untouchable was sitting in a cell thinking about all the things he should have done differently. And the truth that had been buried in the ground was above ground now, and in the hands of people who would not put it back. And Elias Mercer, who had stopped feeling things on purpose and then run out of the ability to stop, sat on the steps of a hotel in Cheyenne and let that be enough. The ride back to Redstone took 6 days. Not because the distance required it, but because Elias made a deliberate choice to go slow. The crisis was over, or the acute part of it was, the running and hiding and calculating part. What came after that was something else, something that didn't benefit from being rushed, and he was old enough and scarred enough to know the difference between urgency and habit. They had been moving fast for so long that the bodies kept expecting it, kept bracing for whatever was coming next, and he wanted to give all three of them, himself included, time to understand that nothing was coming, that the next thing on the road was just the road. He told the girls this on the morning they left Cheyenne, while he was loading the saddlebags and the roan was doing its usual morning performance of pretending it had never been saddled before. "We're not in a hurry," he said. Raina looked at him with the faint suspicion she still brought to unexpected statements. "Why not?" "Because we've been in a hurry for 5 days and there's no reason to be anymore." She considered this. "Okay," she said. And then, "Can we stop somewhere and get food that isn't hardtack?" "Yes," he said. "We absolutely can." They stopped that first afternoon at a roadhouse outside of Cheyenne that had a kitchen run by a woman who clearly considered feeding people one of the more serious obligations a person could undertake. She put down plates without being asked for quantities, and refilled them without being asked for that either. And Lily, who had maintained her composure through 4 days of crisis and official proceedings and the formal confirmation of her parents' murders, looked at the plate in front of her and said very quietly, "This is the best thing I've ever eaten. The woman behind the counter heard it and didn't say anything, but she came back 10 minutes later with a second piece of pie and set it down without comment and went back to her work. Elias watched this happen and thought about what it cost to feed someone who needed feeding. It wasn't much. It almost never was. They stayed one night on the road at a traveler's camp where 3 other groups had settled in for the evening. A family heading west with a wagon loaded past sensible limits, 2 drovers taking a small herd north, and an older couple traveling in a light rig who had been married long enough that they moved around each other with the unconscious choreography of people who have stopped noticing how well they know each other's habits. Raina watched the older couple across the fire with the focused attention she brought to things that interested her. The woman said something Elias didn't catch, and the man laughed. A short, startled laugh, the kind you make when something is funnier than you expected. And the woman looked pleased with herself in the way people look when they've gotten a laugh out of someone who is pretending not to find it funny. "They've been doing that for 40 years, probably," Raina said, low, not to anyone in particular. Elias looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "The way he laughs. Like he's still surprised she's funny." She paused. "Pa laughed like that at Ma. Even at the end, when things were bad, sometimes she'd say something and he'd laugh that way." She was quiet for a moment. "I used to think that was just what adults did. Now I think it's not common." He didn't answer right away. The fire snapped. Across the camp, the older man was saying something back to his wife, gesturing at the sky. And she was listening with the particular patience of someone who has heard a version of this observation before and doesn't mind hearing it again. "No," Elias said finally. "It's not common." Raina looked at him. "Was your wife funny?" "Wife?" It landed differently than he expected. Not painfully, just cleanly, the way a question lands when it's asked without agenda. "She was," he said. "Funnier than she thought she was, which is the best kind." "What was her name?" "Clara." Raina turned this over. "That's a good name." She thought so too, he said, and found that he meant it without the weight he usually felt when he thought about her, which was not the absence of the weight so much as a change in what the weight meant. 5 years of carrying something alone, and then, without planning it, saying the name to a 9-year-old by a campfire in Wyoming, and having the 9-year-old say, "That's a good name," as if that were all it needed to be. He looked at the fire. "She would have liked you," he said. "Both of you." Raina was quiet for a moment. "Would she have been okay with us coming to the house?" "She would have been angry I waited as long as I did," Elias said. Raina made the sound that was almost a laugh. It lasted a little longer this time before she sealed it off. Progress, he thought. Lily, from the other side of the fire where she'd been quietly watching the stars, said, "I think she would have taught Raina how to not scare people when she looks at them." "I don't scare people," Raina said. "You scare me sometimes," Lily said. "That's different. You know what I'm thinking." "That's what makes it scary." Elias watched them bicker with the easy, practiced rhythm of people who have been conducting the same argument for years and enjoy it more than they admit, and felt something settle in his chest. Not dramatically, not in any way that would make a good story later, just a quiet, almost physical rearrangement of the weight he'd been carrying, like furniture moved to a better position in a room. They arrived in Redstone on a Thursday morning in late August, when the summer heat had finally started showing the first faint signs of exhaustion, and the light had shifted into the slightly cooler, clearer angle that meant September was coming. The town looked different than it had a week ago, though physically it was the same. The difference was in the people. A quality in the street that Elias noticed before he could name it. A kind of looseness, the specific ease of a place that has been holding its breath for a long time and has recently been told it can stop. Groups of people talking on the sidewalk who probably would have kept their voices lower a week ago. A man in front of the feed store who nodded at Elias as they passed with the direct, unhidden look of someone who had heard what happened and was not hiding that he'd heard it. Word had moved fast, the way it always moved in small places with large events. They rode to his property first, the old homestead 3 miles out, because there were things that needed doing before he could take the girls to Redstone's single land office and begin the process that Adkins' Cheyenne lawyer had described as straightforward in the way that things involving paperwork and waiting are straightforward, meaning not simple, but eventually completable. He stopped the horses in front of the house and sat on the roan for a moment looking at it. It looked like what it was, a house that a man had been living in alone for 5 years without particularly trying. The garden was a study in neglect. The fence needed 2 new posts. The porch step was soft at the right end and had been soft for 3 years. The paint on the window trim had gone from its original white to a weathered gray that was probably charming in a painting and was, in practice, just wood that needed attention. "This is it?" Raina said. "This is it." A pause. "It's not terrible," she said. "I know what it is," he said. "It needs work." "A lot of it," Lily said, not unkindly, looking at the fence posts. "Yes," Elias said. "A lot of it." He climbed down off the roan. On. The weeks that followed were not easy in the way that fresh starts are not easy, which is to say they were full of small difficulties that individually were nothing and collectively were a constant renegotiation of everything. He had been alone in that house for 5 years, and every room had the specific organization of long solitude, things placed for one person's convenience, routines built around one person's rhythms, silences calibrated to a single occupant. All of that cracked open the first day and kept cracking. Raina had opinions about the kitchen, specific, considered, non-negotiable opinions, which she expressed with the same flat directness she brought to everything. The flour should be closer to the stove. The water barrel should be on the left side, not the right. The single cup on the shelf needed company immediately, which Elias handled by the end of the first week. Lily reorganized the storage room without telling anyone, and when Elias went to find something in its old location and it wasn't there, she told him exactly where it was and why the new location made more sense and was correct on both counts, which made it difficult to argue. He didn't argue. He adjusted. He was surprised to find that adjusting was not as hard as he'd thought it would be. Not easy. He was not going to pretend it was easy, but not the mountain he'd been imagining. He'd been alone so long, he'd assumed that aloneness was structural, some permanent alteration that grief had made to the architecture of who he was. What he found instead was that it had been circumstantial, that the capacity for other people had just been waiting, the way a room waits when it's been shut up, stuffy, dark, in need of airing out, but still a room. He wrote to Adkins once a week for the first month, as required. Updates on his location and the girl's situation, in case the formal trial proceedings needed him before the date already scheduled. Adkins wrote back with the same Kansas efficiency he applied to everything, short and specific, and occasionally containing a piece of news about the case that Elias would read and then share with the girls over dinner. The news was, almost uniformly, what Adkins had said it would be. Grant's cooperation had opened the case wide. The 3 territorial officials named in the documents were arrested in the first 2 weeks, one in Cheyenne, one in Laramie, one in a boarding house in Denver, who appeared to have been planning a further trip and was dissuaded from it by the presence of 2 federal deputies. The mine supervisors were taken into custody and were, according to Adkins, cooperating with the enthusiasm of men who understood that the first one to speak got the better end of the arrangement. Gideon Vance's trial was set for November. Elias read that particular letter at the kitchen table one morning in September while the girls were outside. He read it twice, set it down, looked at the 2 extra cups on the shelf, and sat with the feeling for a while before he could name it. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was something older and quieter than that. The specific feeling of a thing that has been wrong for a long time finally being, however imperfectly and belatedly, addressed, not fixed. The dead didn't come back. The years didn't return. Eliza Cade was still dead, and Thomas Cade was still dead, and 2 little girls had still spent months sleeping behind livery stables in the July heat, eating garbage they found in knocked-over barrels. That had happened. That would always have happened. But it was no longer happening, and the men responsible for it were no longer walking around Redstone Valley with the settled ease of people who have never had to account for anything. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. What? The Guardian filing went through in October, after 2 visits to a territorial court and 1 appearance before a judge who asked Elias 3 careful questions about his means and intentions and asked the girls 2 questions directly, the second of which was addressed to Raina. "Do you want this?" Raina had looked at the judge with her full, unguarded attention. No calculation, no evasion, just the answer she'd already known. "Yes?" she said. The judge looked at Lily. "Yes," Lily said without waiting to be asked. The paperwork was filed the same afternoon. Walking out of the courthouse, Raina was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Does anything feel different?" Elias thought about it honestly. "Not different," he said, "just more real." She nodded slowly. "Like it was already true and now there's a piece of paper that knows about it. Something like that." She walked beside him for a block and then, without preamble, without looking at him, she said, "I don't think I can call you Pa. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I just want you to know that's not about you." "I know," he said. "It's about him," she said. "I know, Raina." She was quiet again. "Elias is fine." "Elias is fine," he agreed. Lily, who had been walking slightly ahead, turned around and looked at them both. She had a look on her face that was the Lily version of exasperation, which was a raised eyebrow and a slight compression of the lips. "I was going to call him Elias anyway," she said. "I've been calling him Elias since week 1. I don't know why this required a conversation." Raina looked at her. "Because some things require a conversation." "Some things," Lily said. "Not all things." Elias walked between them and kept his mouth shut and thought that this too was something Clara would have found funnier than it was. But November came cold and sharp the way Wyoming Novembers always did, and with it came the trial. They traveled to Cheyenne by train, which was the girls' first time on a train, and which Lily approached with the methodical interest she applied to all new mechanisms, studying the engine at the platform, asking a tolerant engineer 2 precise questions about the pressure gauge, sitting at the window for the first hour watching the terrain with the expression she used for canyon walls and rock formations. Raina sat beside her and said, at one point, "It's a train, Lily." And Lily said, without looking away from the window, "Everything is worth understanding." The trial of Gideon Vance lasted 9 days. Elias had been in courtrooms before, though not for anything of this scale. This was a federal proceeding, with a federal judge brought in from Denver and a prosecution team that had clearly spent the better part of 3 months building something airtight out of Thomas Cade's documents and Grant's testimony and the additional material found in Vance's own safe. The courtroom was full every day. Vance sat at the defense table looking like what he was, a man who had spent 11 years being the most powerful person in any room he entered, now sitting in a room where he had no power at all. He was still physically imposing, still wore his authority in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his chin. But it was wearing thin now, the performance of it, like a coat that's been worn too many seasons. Elias watched him and felt no particular triumph. He'd expected to feel something larger, a satisfaction proportional to the wrong that was being addressed. What he felt instead was quieter and less clean than that. A dull, heavy recognition that this was the correct outcome, that it was happening, and that it would not give Thomas Cade his life back or Eliza Cade hers, and that correctness was not the same as restoration. He said this to Raina one evening during the trial, not planning to, just saying it because it was true. She thought about it for a moment. Pa used to say justice wasn't about fixing what happened. It was about making it count. She looked at her hands, like, if you just bury what happened, then the people who died, they just died for nothing. But if you take what they died for and make something out of it, then maybe... She stopped, tried again. They didn't die for nothing, even if they would have rather lived. He looked at her. Is that too simple? She said. No, he said. I think your father was right. She looked at the table. He was right about most things, she said, and there was grief in it and also something like pride, the specific pride of a child who understands, from a distance she never wanted to have, what her parent actually was. Raina and Lily testified on the 7th day. Elias sat in the gallery and watched, and he did not take his eyes off them, and he was careful not to let his hands grip the bench rail too hard because he didn't want to show the thing that was happening in his chest, which was fear. Simple, specific, parental fear, which was its own education. Raina went first. She sat in the witness chair with her back straight and her hands folded on the railing, and she answered every question in the clear, flat voice she'd been using since the first morning he'd found her in the alley. The voice that said, I have nothing to hide and nothing to perform. I'm just going to tell you what happened. She told it from the beginning, her father's discoveries, the records, the nights in the canyon, the mother who had tried to speak and been silenced. She told it without embellishment and without stumbling and without looking away from the prosecution's questions or the defense's attempts to find inconsistency in her account. There were no inconsistencies. She was 9 years old and she remembered everything. When the defense attorney asked her, in the tone attorneys use when they are trying to make a witness seem unreliable, whether she was certain about the specific dates, whether a child could really be expected to accurately recall exact dates during a period of trauma, Raina looked at him with the expression Lily had once described as the scary one and said, My father was a careful man. He wrote dates on everything. He taught us that if something is worth remembering, it's worth remembering correctly. I remember correctly. The attorney tried 2 more questions and then stopped. Lily was briefer. She said what she'd seen, when she'd seen it, where she'd been standing. She did not elaborate and did not need to. When she was done, the prosecuting attorney thanked her and she said, You're welcome, with the polite finality of someone who has completed a task. On the 9th day, the jury was out for 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Vance received his sentence standing, which was the only thing Elias saw in him that he could acknowledge as dignity. The man taking the news on his feet, not flinching. It didn't change anything. It was just the last thing a powerful man could do when the power was gone, which was to stand there. The gallery erupted into noise around Elias. People had been waiting for this for years without knowing they were waiting, had been carrying the unease of a county run by a man who made problems disappear, had been walking around the specific edginess of a place where too many questions went unanswered. The noise was release, and it was complicated, and it was real. Elias sat still in the middle of it. Beside him, Lily said, "It's done." "It's done," he said. She let out a breath. Not dramatically, just a breath, long and even, like a person setting something down. Raina was looking at the front of the courtroom with an expression he recognized, the ceiling look, the one that was refusing something in public. She held it for a long moment and then brought her eyes down and looked at Elias. "He said it would work," she said. "The first night. You said it would work." "Your father's work made it work," Elias said. "We carried it," she said. "You did," he said. She nodded once, the same way she accepted other facts, without ceremony, just acknowledgement. Then she stood up and said, "Can we go home?" He stood too. "Yeah," he said. "We can go home. Just..." They were back in Redstone by December. The roses went in the ground on a Saturday in early spring, when the Wyoming soil had softened enough to take root without fighting back too hard. Elias dug the holes with a short-handled spade, while Raina directed, not because she doubted his ability to dig a hole, but because she had strong opinions about spacing and drainage, and the angle of the south light, which she'd been thinking about since October. Lily handled the cuttings themselves. She'd kept them in the wax paper through everything, the trial, the train, the winter, and they had, against reasonable odds, survived. 6 of them. Her mother's roses, pressed and patient, waiting. She unwrapped each one with the same careful attention she gave to everything that mattered, and set them beside the holes one by one. "Ma planted these from her mother's garden," she said. Not to anyone in particular. Just saying it, putting the fact into the air where it could be heard. Gran brought them from Ohio when she came west. They were already old by then. Elias stopped digging and looked at the cuttings. 6 small, unremarkable pieces of stem wrapped in wax paper, containing the unbroken chain of something that had been carried west in a wagon and planted in new ground and lived and been cut back and carried again, one generation to the next. "They're tough," he said. "They have to be," Lily said. "Everything out here has to be." She pressed the first cutting into the soil with both hands, carefully, the way you handle something you understand the value of. Raina crouched beside her and helped firm the dirt around it, and then the second and the third. Elias dug the remaining holes and they worked down the line together, the 3 of them, in the particular silence that happens when people are doing something that means more than the task itself, and everyone understands that without needing to say it. The last cutting went in nearest the fence, in the spot Raina had designated for it with the logic that it would get the best morning light and the most shelter from the north wind. Raina sat back on her heels and looked at the line of them. 6 small hopes pressed into Wyoming dirt in early spring with no guarantee they'd take, no certainty the cold wouldn't come back hard and undo the whole thing. "They might not survive," she said. Not despair, just accuracy. "They might not," Elias said. "But they might," Lily said. She was right, and they all knew it, and that was enough. The things that changed in Redstone Valley over the next year changed slowly, as things in small places do. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small rearrangements. The new sheriff was a man named Briggs, who had worked as a deputy in Laramie and had the particular quality of someone who understands that authority is a function of responsibility, not the other way around. He was unremarkable in the best possible way. People stopped thinking about him, which, in a county that had spent 11 years thinking constantly about its sheriff, was a profound relief. 2 of the families whose men had died in the Belmore mine over the years came forward after the trial with additional testimony that added counts to the record and added, eventually, a settlement from the mine's owners that would never be adequate and was still something. A woman named Dorothea Marsh, widow of the man Lily had once said was too careful to be caught in a collapse, stood in the Redstone courthouse and gave testimony about what she'd suspected for 4 years and been afraid to say, and when she was done, she stood outside on the courthouse steps and cried with the specific release of someone who has been holding a thing in place for a very long time and has finally been told they can let go. Elias saw her there and stopped and didn't say anything, because he knew what it was to carry something that long, and he knew that what she needed in that moment was not comfort, but space. He nodded at her. She nodded back. That was enough. The garden took over the summer. Raina had opinions about that too. She planted beans and squash and tomatoes and managed the watering with a precision that made Elias feel slightly embarrassed about his 5 years of neglect. He helped where she let him and stayed out of it where she didn't, which was most of it, and the garden produced more than the two of them could eat by August, which was how they ended up at the Saturday market in Redstone with a wagon load of vegetables and Lily conducting the transactions with the focused, fair efficiency of a small person who has strong views about honest exchange. He stood at the edge of the market stall and watched her count change into a woman's palm with the careful accuracy she brought to everything and thought about a miner in a lamplit office, writing down dates and names with the patient belief that documented truth outlasted the people trying to suppress it. He thought that Thomas Cade would have liked to see this. He thought he was glad to see it for him. Waucheet. Cutter Hobbs came by in September, the way he always did every few weeks, to check that Elias was still breathing. He stopped his horse at the fence and looked at the house and the garden and the two girls who were doing something complicated with fence wire in the yard and said, without inflection, "You been busy." "Some," Elias said. Hobbs looked at the garden, looked at the fence repairs, looked at the roses along the fence line, which had taken all 6 of them, improbably, stubbornly, and were putting out new growth in small, determined bursts of green. "Those were your wife's?" Hobbs said. "Theirs," Elias said. "Their mothers. Originally their grandmothers." Hobbs absorbed this. He was a man of few words deployed with precision, and he sat on his horse for a moment in the particular silence of someone who has known you long enough to understand what he's looking at. "You doing all right?" he said. Elias thought about the honest answer. He looked at the garden and the fence repairs and the roses taking root and the two girls arguing over fence wire in the yard, and he thought about Clara, and about Thomas and Eliza Cade, and about the particular thing that happens when you survive your own grief long enough to find yourself on the other side of it holding something you didn't plan for. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." Hobbs nodded once. "Good," he said. He turned his horse around. Then he stopped and looked back. "She'd be glad. You're Clara, in case you wondered." He rode off before Elias could answer. Elias stood at the fence for a while. The Wyoming morning was cool and clear, the kind of September morning that was just starting to put its cards on the table, everything precise and unhurried in the way of weather that knows it has time. The light was coming over the ridge at the long golden angle that meant the year was tilting toward its end. Raina called something to Lily from across the yard. Lily called something back. A disagreement about the fence wire, by the sound of it, conducted with the specific energy of people who have been having the same disagreement for years, and have arrived at a comfortable groove in it. He turned from the fence and walked back toward the house. Later he would try to think about what had changed and find it difficult to name precisely, which was probably correct. The large things were easy. Vance in prison, the land fraud dismantled, the truth documented and public, 2 girls with a home and a person who would not leave. Those were the facts, the things with edges, the things you could put words to. But the real change was smaller than any of that. It was the weight in his chest that had shifted position. It was the cups on the shelf. It was Lily reading rock walls like a surveyor's apprentice, and Raina dividing things with exact fairness, and the roses coming up green against the fence in defiance of soil that had been cold and unworked for 5 years. It was the particular thing that happens when a person who has spent a long time protecting himself from the cost of caring discovers that the cost has been paid anyway, in the 5 years of not living fully, and that the protection was always the more expensive option. He sat on the porch that evening while the girls finished their work in the yard, and he looked at the fence line where the roses were putting up their stubborn, unhurried new growth, and he thought about what Lily had said on that first night in the canyon. Good people are sometimes wrong about who deserves their trust, and that's not the same as being wrong about everything. He had been wrong about a lot of things. Wrong about whether caring was worth the risk. Wrong about whether the gray country in the middle was survival or just a more comfortable name for giving up. Wrong about whether the walls he'd built were protecting him or holding him in place. He had not been wrong about the corn cake or about the 2 girls who had divided it. The sun went down over the Wyoming ridgeline, and the roses held their ground against the fence, and the evening settled into the house around the 3 of them. And Elias Mercer, a man with cracked knuckles and a blister scar and a right boot that still dragged slightly when he walked, sat on his porch and let himself be where he was. Not fixed, not restored to what he'd been before. Something different from that, something harder to name. A person shaped by all of it, by Clara and the grief and the 5 hollow years and the alley behind the silver rail and the canyon walls and the tin box and the courtroom and the roses coming up in the spring. Just a man, alive, present, choosing it, finally, on purpose. The frontier remained what it was, indifferent, hard, beautiful in its stripped-down way, not interested in anyone's suffering or anyone's small victories. But there was a light on in the house, and there was food on the table, and 2 voices arguing about something across the yard, and a row of rose cuttings in the ground that had been carried across 3 generations and half a continent and come through winter intact. Some things hold on. Some things are worth the holding.